principles of ceremony?
The four principles of ceremony. Oh boy, you're going to ask me tough questions from my book. I haven't read it lately. Well, I'm not sure I could say the four principles of ceremony. I think the thing about sacred ceremony, there's some distinctions between ceremony and ritual that's probably somewhat intellectual, but I think there's important. I think all ceremonies began with the shaman, of the indigenous tribe. And what tended to happen over time is that people who, after the shaman passed on, is people would try to replicate that ceremony, and they would do typically a good job of it, doing it exactly like the shaman did. And then again and again and again over generations, and it became sacred ritual. The difference there with ritual is that you can't deviate, from the ritual itself. If anybody ever tried to do that, it would create a little bit of havoc. The other thing I notice about what I make the distinction in sacred ceremony and the ones that I've done is that often we go into this kind of zone with sacred ceremony. And in the zone, and in my role as facilitator, yeah, there's structure. Don't get me wrong. There's a certain structure that is sort of an outline, if you will, of the ceremony. But I've had it happen more than once where something comes in terms of inspiration that causes the ceremony or the structure of the ceremony to deviate just a bit. I'm trying to think of a good example of that. Instead of, a friend of mine was talking about doing earth honoring ceremony, and there was a certain, I think it was a power stick that was in a certain place. And after doing the ceremony a couple of times, he realized, he said, no, that's not in the right place. It had to be in a little bit different place that was in alignment with the sun and that sort of thing. And that's the kind of thing that can shift or change in ceremony, either as it's repeated or even in the midst of the ceremony, is what I've experienced. So I should have studied probably my book a little bit closer. I haven't taught about it for a while, so that was sorry, I couldn't answer that question directly. I think that's something that in a lot of our Western culture and our kind of dissociated state that we have as human beings with the natural world. And don't get me wrong, I think it's wonderful to be able to have air conditioning and 98-degree weather, On the other hand, there's a compromise and a cost to that, and that's just who we are and what we do right now. Rhythm and music is one of those things. One of my favorite pieces that I teach is actually from someone who I admire greatly. Her name is Angeles Arrien. And Angeles has written a book called The Fourfold Way, and she doesn't travel much. She's pretty much stays in Northern California. But a wonderful shaman in her own right. Whether she would say that or not, I'm not sure. But anyway, her teachings are wonderful because they're built on the fours and they're built on the medicine wheel and the four directions, etc. And she says cross-culturally, she's Basque, that's her history. And that's that region, I think, near Spain, that they kind of leave it alone, and it's a separate sort of place where they kind of let, the governments let them do their own thing. She studied a lot of shamans and shamanism cross-culturally, and so she's come up with some various ideas that she's synthesized. And she said that in some traditions, indigenous traditions, when you go to the shaman for a healing, the shaman will ask you 4 questions. And this is my favorite piece, one of my favorite pieces. The first question is, when did you stop dancing? And the second question is, when did you stop singing? And the third question is, when did you stop, I have to think about what the third question, when did you stop being enchanted by stories? And then the fourth question is, when did you stop listening to the sweet sound of silence? So I think that kind of wraps it around, and of course you can imagine as the patient coming to the shaman, depending on your answers, there was likely to be a prescription there. Dance, sing, go out and be in the stillness, etc. So the rhythm and music, I think, is one of those things that's essential. One of the things that in shamanism and in ceremony that rhythm and music does is often it will put us into that zone or that trance state. And that trance state's been called various things, but it's a very healthy trance state. Ritual space or ceremonial space, or I think Harner calls it the shamanic state of consciousness, but it moves us into a whole different timeless realm, which is wonderful. And it's been shown in scientific studies, more than one, that if you do a very monotonous rhythm of anywhere from 4 to 7 beats or rattles per second, that after a few minutes, let's say 10 to 12 minutes typically is what the studies show, but sooner if you've got practice at it, that your brain will start to synchronize with that. You'll move from the beta rhythms to the alpha, down to the delta, theta, and then the delta ultimately. So there's science is coming around to telling us or confirming for us what certainly indigenous people in shamanic cultures have been saying for years, or been doing and been practicing for years. I just really think that that should be a part of everybody's life. You know, music, sing in the shower, listen to music, but even more than listening to music, they'll participate in it. You know, drumming circles, things like that. Drumming, there's a number of studies on drumming and the advantages of drumming. Adolescents in trouble, they go into drumming circles, they're able to kind of discharge a lot of their tension and their anger and their stress. Alzheimer's patients, one fascinating study is with Alzheimer's patients, when they get together and drum together as a group, there would be periods of lucidity for a while following the drumming. Things like that, certain measures of the immune response with certain kinds of drumming would increase. Just a real, whether it's ceremony or not, I think the drumming itself is something that, again, I encourage people to do it. More and more people are doing it, that's the good news. And more people are connecting with the natural world in some way, even in spite of our air-conditioned automobiles, etc. And I think there's definitely that urge to return, not necessarily return to nature or go back and live like we used to, you know, back in the cave days, but at least develop more of an affinity and I guess the best way I'd say it is to remember who we are. And that's the opposite of dismember. I always find that wordplay interesting, is to remember, put back together. And that's all we really need to do, is remember who we really are. That's a lot of what this work is about, just help us remember. The rites of passage, first off, we typically think of rites of passage as boyhood to manhood or girlhood to womanhood, something like that. And I think that is an important one that's been missed, I think especially for men. You know, I think my daughter, who's now 27, she had this wonderful ceremony that a friend of mine did for her you know, I had no right as a male and as her father to facilitate that ceremony, in my belief. I think it was something that needed to be done by a woman or women. And they had it was after her first menstrual cycle, and so the gal, Donna's her name, brought a red pouch, and they had certain symbols in the pouch. It was just a wonderful what I heard about the ceremony. I didn't witness it, and like I say, I took myself out of it. Boys, there's just so many misguided boys that have to grow and guess how to be men. It's just unfortunate. I think that a lot of the inner city gangs and such are just that kind of a symptom, if you will, of that lack of the elders taking charge of the initiation. By elders, anybody really over 30 could be an elder. There's some wonderful, well, James Edward Olmos comes to mind, you know, some wonderful elders who are, you know, trying to reach these inner city boys. But what happens, you got 19-year-olds initiating 11-year-olds. And that's tragic. And the way that you're initiated, the rite of passage is to go out and shoot somebody, things like that. You know,